"We don't need your opinion, Mom." The words didn't just sting. They severed like a razor-sharp wire, drawn taut and then cut. They were delivered with a practiced ease devoid of hesitation, as if she had run through them in her mind 1,000 times, perfecting their cold finality. I stood suspended in that moment, a porcelain serving plate still clutched in my hand, centered awkwardly in the living room of my only daughter, Sandy. It was a room I had helped transform from a bare shell into a warm space, poring over fabric samples and paint chips for hours. It was a room nestled within a house whose mortgage I had co-signed, putting my own financial security on the line, without a second thought. It was a holiday gathering for which I had spent the previous day stirring gravies and roasting meats, the aroma of my efforts still faintly clinging to my clothes. Sandy didn't even grant me a glance after her pronouncement. Her head remained bowed slightly, her focus seemingly fixed on the condensation beading on her wineglass. Her friends, a group of sleek, polished individuals I barely knew, offered low, polite chuckles, their eyes mirroring Sandy's fixed somewhere near their feet, or the elegant rug. Eli, my grandson, my sweet boy, looked up briefly, his brow furrowed in confusion, a single innocent blink. Then, sensing the shift in the air, he quickly averted his gaze, returning to whatever child's game occupied his attention. I said nothing. No defense, no outburst, no tearful question demanding, "Why?" Instead, I offered a smile. It was a fragile mask, the kind you learn to wear when your insides are collapsing. A silent acknowledgement that, although your heart is breaking, your dignity requires a final, stoic performance. I turned away from the tableau, the serving plate still heavy in my hand, and walked towards the kitchen. It felt as though I were ascending an invisible staircase, each step weighted with years of unspoken expectations and quiet sacrifices. In the kitchen, the familiar space where I had prepared countless meals for her, I carefully placed the plate onto the cool countertop. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the air suddenly thin and inadequate, and then quietly stepped outside. The crisp autumn air bit at my skin, a physical sensation grounding me in the present moment. That was it. The precise point of inflection. The exact second when something fundamental shifted within me. It wasn't the raw, hot surge of anger I might have expected. It was something colder, sharper, and far more decisive clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't need to shout or weep or rail against injustice. It simply observes the landscape and makes a quiet, firm decision. 5 minutes later, still sitting in the driver's seat of my car, parked just down the street, I pulled out my phone. My fingers navigated automatically to my contacts list. I scrolled until I found the entry still labeled precisely as it had been for nearly a decade. Tom, Will, Trust. I tapped the screen, initiating the call. "Tom," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil I felt just moments before. "It's Lena. I'd like to make a change to my will. Several significant changes." Prior to that cutting moment, before the cold words and the subsequent silent departure, my life had revolved entirely around Sandy. She was my world, my singular focus, the beating heart of my existence. I was only 27 years old when Jack, my beloved husband, and her father, died unexpectedly from a sudden stroke. Sandy was just 7, a small, bewildered child clutching my hand in the vast, echoing space of the funeral home. Standing there beside his casket, tears blurring my vision, I remember making a solemn vow to myself, no matter how difficult life became, no matter the obstacles or hardships, I would give her everything. Absolutely everything I had or could possibly attain. And I kept that promise. With a fierce, unwavering resolve, I took on extra shifts at the high school where I taught English. I tutored students after hours, sacrificing evenings and weekends. For an entire decade, I skipped vacations, delayed repairs on the house, and wore the same coats and shoes year after year, all to save for her future. Every single decision I made during those years, from the modest, fuel-efficient car I drove to the meals I sometimes skipped so there would be more for her, was fundamentally rooted in one overriding goal: to ensure her life would be better, easier, and more secure than mine had been after Jack's passing. We were close, or at least I genuinely believed we were. Our lives were deeply intertwined. I was her confidant, her cheerleader, her safe harbor. When she received the acceptance letter from Georgetown University, her dream school, we both dissolved into tears, a mixture of pride, relief, and the bittersweet ache of knowing she would soon leave the nest. To help cover the unexpected dorm costs, I quietly sold the antique pearl necklace my grandmother had left me, a cherished family heirloom passed down through generations. Sandy never explicitly asked me to do something like that, but she also didn't object or try to stop me when I mentioned the financial strain. I didn't resent it. I considered it a sacred gift, an investment in the rejackable woman she was clearly becoming. After graduating college, she quickly landed a promising job at a prestigious consulting firm. Later, she met and married Jack, a genuinely kind man with a gentle demeanor and a wonderfully patient smile. 3 years into their marriage, they welcomed Eli into the world. I was there in the delivery room, my hand tightly clasped in Sandy's whispering words of encouragement and breathing through contractions with her. When the nurses finally placed Eli in her arms, swaddled and perfect, she looked up at me, her eyes shining with tears, and through a shaky breath she said, "Oh, Mom, I get it now. I really do." That moment, that raw, honest recognition of the profound weight and boundless love of motherhood stayed with me. It felt like the closing of a circle, like she finally understood the silent, tireless devotion, the quiet sacrifices I had made for her entire life, without ever demanding recognition or even a thank you. Following her maternity leave, when the realities of balancing a demanding career with a newborn became apparent, I naturally stepped in to help with childcare. It became a regular rhythm, 3 days a week. I would pick Eli up from daycare, take him to the park for an hour of chasing pigeons and sliding, bring him back to their house, make him dinner, carefully navigating toddler culinary preferences, and stay until Jack or Sandy arrived home to handle the bedtime routine. This arrangement allowed Sandy to stay late at the office or catch up on work from home in the precious hours between Eli's pickup and sleep. In the evenings, I'd often receive texts from her. "Couldn't do this without you, Mom." Or, "Lifesaver. Thank you, thank you, thank you." I'd smile every time I saw those messages, and often saved them, holding onto them like precious stones. They felt like genuine expressions of gratitude and reliance, meaning infinitely more to me than any store-bought flowers or hall jack card could. Weekends, especially Sundays, were often reserved for us. There were leisurely Sunday brunches, impromptu shopping trips, for clothes or toys for Eli, and cozy movie nights on their big sectional couch, Eli nestled between us. We shared so much laughter during that time, particularly reminiscing about Sandy's dramatic teenage years or rehashing funny family anecdotes. She'd playfully tease me for still clinging to my ancient flip phone, and I'd roll my eyes with mock exasperation when she insisted that mashed avocado on toast constituted a complete and nutritious meal. It was warm, familiar, deeply comforting. I genuinely believed I was an essential, integrated part of her life, not merely a convenient helper or a designated babysitter, but someone she still leaned on for support, guidance, and comfort, someone she still respected and cherished. In fact, in my will drafted years before these changes began to unfold, I had planned to leave absolutely everything to her when I was gone. My modest house, my accumulated savings, my entire jewelry box that held every heirloom, every precious piece of gold and silver and stone passed down through 4 generations of women in our family, from my great-grandmother's wedding band to the pearl necklace rebought years later after the first one was sold for Georgetown. I pictured her someday opening that box, perhaps with Eli beside her, sharing stories about his grandmother, the woman who had taught her how to stand tall, how to navigate the world with strength and grace. Back then, during those golden years, Sandy actively created space for me in her home, in her conversations, in her world. I wasn't just Mom. I was her person, her confidant, her ally. We didn't always see eye to eye on everything. No mother and adult daughter ever do. But there was never a time she made me feel like I was an imposition or simply in the way. Even when her demanding career began to consume more of her time, she would still make the effort to call and ask genuinely how I was doing. Or she'd stop by with Eli just because he declared a sudden urgent craving for Grandma's legendary grilled cheese sandwich. It was a comfortable, natural rhythm, the kind you don't truly notice or appreciate, until it falters, until the beat is off. Small gestures, really, but they were the tiny threads that wove together the tapestry of our shared life. A shared favorite TV show we'd watch together, on the phone discussing characters and plot twists. Leftovers wrapped just the way I liked them for easy transport home. Birthday cards signed with heartfelt affection like, "Love you more than coffee." A high compliment indeed from Sandy. I clung to those moments, those small affirmations for a long time. Even when things began to subtly shift, when the calls became shorter, the texts less frequent, the invitations more conditional, I told myself it was temporary. "She's just stressed," I'd reason. "It's a rough patch, this demanding job a young child." People change, I knew that. But surely love a bond as deep as ours didn't just vanish overnight. But looking back now with the harsh light of retrospect, I can see the slow, almost imperceptible process by which I was being moved to the periphery, like a cherished photo frame, gradually shifted to a higher shelf. It was still there within sight, but increasingly harder to reach, increasingly less central. And I was the one doing all the adjusting. I was the one bending, making excuses, forgiving slight stepping back. Because that, I told myself, was what mothers did. For a while I managed to convince myself that was enough. Just being present, even on the edges, was enough. The shift was incredibly subtle. So subtle, in fact, that if I hadn't later replayed the scene meticulously, frame by agonizing frame in my mind 100 times, I might have dismissed it entirely, or perhaps just attributed it to a bad mood on her part. Sandy had invited me to brunch at her house. It wasn't a big formal affair, just her, Jack, a few co-workers she had recently developed close relationships with, and me. I brought my usual offering, my famous fruit tart, the one Sandy had requested for her birthday. Every year since she was a little girl, a tradition I cherished. I arrived a little early, as was my habit, intending to help set the table, do some last-minute tidying, or simply keep Eli entertained while she finished her preparations in the kitchen. When I walked in calling out a cheerful greeting, she barely looked up from stirring something on the stove. She simply gestured vaguely with her chin towards a stack of plates on the counter, and said without inflection, "Oh, hey, Mom, can you set those on the patio?" No hug, no warm greeting, just a task. Everyone eventually congregated around the outdoor table on the patio, mimosas, in hand, the air buzzing with conversation. It was a world of corporate jargon networking and shared experiences from conferences in distant cities like Atlanta. It was a crowd Sandy seemed particularly eager to impress. Sharp suits, impeccably styled hair, glossy smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Phones constantly checked for notifications. I knew instantly and viscerally that I didn't belong in this particular stratum of her life. But I didn't mind. I wasn't there for them. I was there for her, simply happy to be included even on the periphery. At one point, Eli, as energetic 10-year-olds are wont to do, wandered over and became fascinated by a nearby bug zapper, its purple glow attracting curious insects. I gently reached out and placed my hand on his arm, saying softly, "Sweetheart, please don't touch that. It could be dangerous." Well, Sandy's head snapped around her eyes, flashing with something I couldn't immediately decipher. Impatience. Annoyance. "Mom, please," she said, her voice carrying, just slightly directed more at her friends than at me. "He's fine." She offered a small, brittle chuckle, but it wasn't warm or genuine. It felt performative, calculated to convey a certain image. The modern, relaxed parent, certainly not an overly anxious one like her mother. One of her co-workers, a woman with sharp features and an even sharper laugh, added, "Kids these days are practically indestructible, Lena. You gotta let them explore." Sandy grinned, raised her glass in agreement, and added the comment that truly landed like a blow. "Exactly. And besides," she said, a light dismissive tone lacing her voice, "my mom still thinks it's the 80s. Everything's a hazard to her." The group laughed again, a collective polite titter. I smiled along with them, the muscles in my face stiff and unfamiliar, but inside I felt the distinct, undeniable shift. It wasn't just the words. It was the way. She said, "My mom," distant, slightly amused, casting me as a quaint, out-of-touch relic from a time she had clearly surpassed and no longer needed. It was the kind of joke people laugh at because it's safe, because it's directed at someone perceived as non-threatening, not because it's genuinely kind or funny. Later, while helping to clear the plates from the patio table, I attempted to contribute to the conversation by bringing up a light-hearted family memory. A road trip we'd taken when Sandy was about 10, specifically. The humorous incident involving her determined attempt to smuggle a Ziploc bag full of seashells through airport security. It was a story she used to find hilarious, one she'd often ask me to recount to Eli, as if it were a treasured family legend. But before I could even finish setting the scene, she waved a dismissive hand, interrupting me. "Oh, God," she groaned loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not this one again." I froze, the plate momentarily suspended in midair. The abruptness, the open irritation in her voice was stunning. That story, which used to elicit peals of laughter, was now tired, embarrassing, disposable. "Excuse me," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "I need to grab the tart from the fridge." I retreated to the kitchen, needing a moment to compose myself. I stood there longer than necessary, staring blindly at the collection of old fridge magnets, many of them child's artwork from Eli's kindergarten days. My face rendered in bright smudged crayon colors, with the proud misspelled declaration, "Best Grammy," scrawled underneath. When I finally returned to the patio, forcing the smile back onto my face, the conversation had moved on entirely. They were now discussing a major project Sandy was leading at her firm. Something clearly important and impressive. One of the women turned to me with a polite smile and said, "You must be so proud of her, Lena." I managed a genuine smile, then a flicker of the old pride asserting itself. "Always," I said, my voice steady. "She's worked incredibly hard to get where she is." Sandy didn't even look up from her plate. She simply reached for her glass, took a sip, and interjected casually, "She tries to take credit for my work ethic, but let's be real, that's all me." The others laughed again, and I joined in a softer, more strained laugh this time. Not because it was funny, but because I felt compelled to participate, to maintain the image of the supportive, agreeable mother who knew her place and wasn't about to cause a scene or appear bitter. That evening, after the last guest had departed and the house had fallen quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator, I lingered by the doorway gathering my purse and keys. I turned to Sandy, who was stacking leftover dishes, with a weary sigh. "You were a little sharp with me today," I said gently, choosing my words carefully, trying to convey my hurt without sounding accusatory. "I wasn't trying to embarrass you." She didn't apologize. She didn't offer an excuse. Her response was instantaneous and delivered with chilling certainty. "Mom?" she said, looking directly at me, her expression serious. "You overstep sometimes. I need you to trust that I've got things handled." I nodded a small automatic movement. "Of course," I replied the word, feeling hollow and inadequate. But something deep inside me felt bruised. Not shattered, not yet, but undeniably jacked. And like any bruise, I knew, with a heavy certainty, that it would likely deepen and darken with time. That was the first time I truly understood, not just on an intellectual level, but in a visceral way, that maybe my role in her life wasn't the permanent, sacred fixture I had always believed it to be. It wasn't untouchable. It was, in fact, optional. After that brunch, the changes began to manifest more tangibly, though still subtly, almost politely. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, no tearful accusations. Instead, there was a quiet, persistent withdrawal that crept in like a slow-moving fog. One day I was her mother, her trusted helper, her reliable safety net, and then, without a clear turning point, without a single explicit conversation, I became something else entirely, a presence to be managed, an obligation to navigate. In the beginning, I made countless excuses for her behavior, trying to rationalize the growing distance. "She's just busy with work," I'd tell myself fiercely, when days stretched into a week without a phone call. "She's tired." I'd reason when our conversations became short, transactional clipped. Quick questions about Eli's schedule, brief updates on my health. Nothing substantial, nothing heartfelt. But deep down, a cold certainty was beginning to take root. I could feel the shift in the way she rushed off the phone, ending calls abruptly with a hurried, "Gotta go," in how she started replying to my thoughtful, longer messages with nothing more than the short, impersonal thumbs-up emojis instead of actual words or sentences. The most painful manifestation of this withdrawal came with Eli, or rather, with my access to him. Picking him up from daycare on Tuesdays and Thursdays had been our time a precious constant in my week. We had our rituals, the quick stop at the park, the shared bag of pretzels, the serious discussions about dinosaurs or superheroes, making silly faces during dinner, reading stories together on the old beige couch in their living room before Jack or Sandy got home. But one Tuesday, I arrived at the daycare center at the usual time, only to be met by the receptionist with a confused look. She informed me gently that Eli had already been picked up. No call, no text message, no heads up whatsoever from Sandy. Just silence. I called her the feeling in my chest a mix of confusion and burgeoning unease more than actual upset initially. She answered after several rings, her voice sounding rushed and slightly distracted, as if I were interrupting something important. "Oh, yeah," she said, a note of feigned casualness in her tone. "I meant to tell you. My new assistant said she could grab him this week. We're just trying to adjust our schedule." I paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat, waiting for clarification that didn't come. "So," I finally asked, my voice carefully, neutral, "am I not doing pickups anymore?" There was another longer beat of silence on her end. Then her voice softened into that performative patience. I was beginning to recognize the kind that sounded outwardly kind, but felt like a subtle brush-off. "Mom, it's not a big deal," she said, sighing faintly. "We're just trying something new with the schedule this week. Don't overthink it." "Okay." I said the single word, tasting like ash, but I did overthink it. I thought about it all night. I lay awake in bed replaying every Tuesday and Thursday, pick up every peanut butter sandwich I'd carefully crafted, trastas, cut off just the way he liked it, every story I'd read to Eli on that worn, familiar couch. None of it seemed mattered now. My role, my dependable presence, had been quietly, unceremoniously outsourced. Then came the holidays. That year, Thanksgiving was deemed a little hectic, according to a brief text message from Sandy. She and Jack were apparently traveling to Napa with some of his colleagues for a work-related event that somehow coincided with a national holiday centered around family gathering. Christmas, she explained weeks later, would just be the three of us this year. She promised she would call on Christmas morning. The call never came. I spent Christmas morning alone in my quiet house watching a rerun of It's a Wonderful Life. For the 20th time, my old cat Jasper curled in my lap. On the kitchen counter sat a half-cooked ham. I couldn't bring myself to finish the smell, filling the house with a lonely, mocking sweetness. I was no longer included in Eli's birthday celebrations either. Sandy started saying that Eli preferred low-key celebrations these days, intimating that large family gatherings were too much for him. But later photos would inevitably pop up online, posted by one of her friends or Jack's colleagues. Elaborate parties filled with brightly colored balloons, hired caterers, and dozens of unfamiliar faces. Not once did I see a picture of the old wooden rocking horse I'd meticulously restored from Sandy's childhood, the one Eli used to adore and ride with gleeful abandon every time he visited. I asked about it once, a casual question tossed into a strained phone conversation. She shrugged audible even over the phone and said they had donated it during their last garage purge. One afternoon in March, I carefully prepared a large pot of my homemade chicken noodle soup, Eli's favorite. Because I'd heard through Judith, Jack's sister, my only remaining family connection to their world, that he had a nasty flu. I drove over to their house, the soup still warm, and rang the doorbell. No one answered. I waited for several minutes, then rang again. Still nothing. Later, as I was driving home, I received a text message from Sandy. "Thanks, Mom. Left it on the porch. Right? Appreciate it." No invitation inside. No offer to step in and see Eli even from a distance. No update on how he was doing, how sick he was, if he was eating. Just a confirmation of receipt, the kind of impersonal text message I might send to a neighbor who had borrowed a cup of sugar. I wish, looking back, that I had confronted her then. that I had stood on her porch and demanded to know what I had done wrong, why she was systematically pushing me out, why everything felt so empty and hollow between us. But I didn't. I was paralyzed by a potent mix of fear and hope. Fear of severing the fragile connection entirely, and hope that this was just a phase, a temporary blip, that things would eventually return to normal, that she would suddenly wake up and realize what she was doing, what she was losing. Instead, I began to shrink. I stopped suggesting dinner plans. I stopped offering to help with errands or tasks. I stopped texting unless she initiated contact first, which increasingly rarely happened. Every time I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over her name in my contacts, I would hesitate. I felt like an imposition, an inconvenience, a constant unwanted reminder of something she no longer desired in her orbit. The woman who used to call me 3 times a day when Eli was teething desperate for advice or just a sympathetic ear now, barely made eye contact. When our paths occasionally crossed, usually at a large unavoidable family event thrown by Jack's side of the family. Even at church members of the congregation, old friends of mine, who had known Sandy since she was a child, would ask their voices laced with well-meaning curiosity. "How's your daughter? Haven't seen her around lately." I became adept at smiling through the pain, at fabricating pleasant generic responses. "Busy," I'd say brightly. "She's doing great, just very busy with work and Eli." And then I'd make a quick excuse, step into the nearest restroom, and sit quietly in a stall, breathing deeply, until the tight, aching knot in my throat began to loosen. There is a unique, devastating pain in becoming invisible to someone you helped shape, someone you poured your entire being into raising. It's a particular kind of grief that doesn't get a funeral, no formal ceremony, no flowers, no closure, no final goodbye. Just distance and silence, a slow quiet, fading, and so little by little I stopped showing up. Not because I wanted to, but because I felt I was no longer wanted. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of crisp fall night that, in years past, would have meant the comforting aroma of chili simmering on the stove, a crackling fire in the fireplace, and Eli curled up on the couch under a soft blanket I had knitted for him when Sandy was pregnant. But that night I found myself sitting stiffly on the very edge of their unfamiliar sofa, my hands clasped in my lap, acutely unsure of why I was even there. Sandy had sent a text earlier in the week, hosting a little dinner on Tuesday, some of Jack's partners and their wives. Come if you're free. There was no warmth in the invitation, no hint of genuine desire for my company, but neither was there a clear rejection. It was neutral, detached, like she was extending a perfunctory courtesy, rather than actually hoping I would accept. But I still said yes. Perhaps a small, hopeful part of me clung to the possibility that this was a sign that maybe things were turning around, that I had perhaps been overly sensitive, that maybe I would walk in and she would greet me with the easy warmth and affection she used to show a genuine hug and a smile that reached her eyes. She didn't. When I arrived, the front door was slightly ajar, indicating that guests had already arrived. I stepped inside cautiously and called out, "Hello." From the kitchen, I heard Sandy's voice sounding distracted and slightly rushed. "Yeah, just come in, Mom. We're in the dining room." I placed the bottle of wine I had brought, a safe, mid-range choice, on the counter. No one acknowledged it. I looked around the entryway and living room. It was beautiful, impeccably arranged candles casting a soft glow, modern and stylish, in a way that made it feel less like a lived-in home and more like a page from a design magazine carefully curated for show. I walked into the dining area where 6 other people were already seated around the table, their conversation a low hum. Everyone looked polished expensive, radiating an air of effortless ease. Sandy introduced me with a casual wave of her hand, barely pausing in her own conversation. "This is my mom, Lena." One of the women, a woman with impeccably styled hair and a perfectly fitted dress, offered a polite, distant smile. "Oh, yes," she said. "You're the one who taught English, right?" I nodded, trying to project a sense of quiet confidence. "Yes," I replied. "For 32 years at the local high school. I retired a couple of years ago." Sandy chimed in a small, seemingly harmless chuckle, accompanying her words. "She used to write all my essays in high school," she said to the table. "She'd call it editing, but let's be real, it was ghostwriting." The table erupted in polite laughter. On the surface, it was a light-hearted jab, but I felt the sharp sting beneath it. I didn't write her papers. I reviewed them. I spent hours teaching her how to structure arguments, how to use evidence, how to think for herself, and write with her own voice and purpose. I said nothing. I smiled that familiar, strained smile. Dinner preceded the conversation, a constant buzzing flow of promotions, jacket trends, expensive home renovations, and upcoming international business trips. I mostly listened, offering small, non-committal nods. I attempted to join in once, mentioning a book I had recently finished, a memoir by a woman who had completely rebuilt her life after a devastating divorce. It was sharp, insightful, and genuinely inspiring. I thought foolishly that it might resonate, that it was a safe, intelligent topic. Sandy interrupted before I could even get past the title. "Mom," she said, her voice carrying an unmistakable edge, though she offered a half smile, meant to soften the blow. "Can we not? This isn't book club." The smile didn't hide the sharpness. In fact, it made it cut deeper, because it was delivered under the guise of lightness. There was a pause. Awkward, palpable, small, but enough to silence the table for a fraction of a second. One of the men cleared his throat pointedly and quickly steered the conversation back to stock options. I felt my face flush, a hot wave of embarrassment washing over me. I pushed a pea around my plate with my fork, suddenly acutely aware of my posture, my age, my clothes, my place, which clearly was not here, not truly. I remained quiet for the rest of the meal, a silent observer at the edges of a world that was hers and not mine. After dinner, as everyone migrated back to the living room for coffee, I stayed behind for a moment to help gather plates from the dining table. I reached out to subtly adjust the large floral centerpiece. It was beautiful, undoubtedly expensive, but slightly too large, blocking the view of the person sitting opposite. Sandy moved quickly, intercepting my hand, and said sharply under her breath, "Just for my ears, don't. I paid someone to design this. Just leave it." The words were so abrupt, so final, that I almost dropped the stack of delicate plates I held. We stood there for a brief moment in the kitchen, just the two of us, surrounded by the remnants of the meal. I looked at her, really looked, trying desperately to find a flicker of the girl who used to fall asleep curled up in my lap, the one who cried genuine tears if I forgot to kiss her goodnight, the one who used to beg for my advice on everything from school crushes to college applications. Sandy. I began softly, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what I did wrong, but..." She didn't allow me to finish. She cut me off, her gaze unwavering. "Mom," she said, her voice level, firm. "You didn't do anything wrong." For a split second, a tiny spark of hope ignited. Was she finally going to apologize, to acknowledge the distance? The spark was extinguished just as quickly. "You're just too much sometimes." She continued the words delivered with startling directness. "You have to understand that not everything needs your input. Just let us do things our way." There it was. Blunt, unambiguous, brutally clear. I stood there stunned into silence, blinking slowly. She looked right at me, waiting for a reaction. Tears, anger, protest. I gave her none. Instead, I offered that same careful, vacant smile I'd worn before, the one that signaled outward composure while my insides were screaming. It was a smile that said, "I hear you," even when the words felt like poison dripping into my soul. I collected my purse, walked over to the couch where Eli was already half asleep, gave him a soft kiss on his forehead, and quietly let myself out the front door. I drove home in silence, my hands clenched tightly on the steering wheel. The road ahead blurry in the dim streetlights. But for the first time in a very long while, I wasn't frantically trying to figure out how to fix everything, how to mend the relationship, how to make her see me again. I was simply driving forward because something inside me, something quiet, steady, and long-suffering, had finally begun to wake up. The morning after that difficult dinner, I awoke to the comforting, familiar scent of old lavender from the sachet on my nightstand and the distinct, long-known creak of my bedroom floorboards as I rose from bed. The house was quiet, filled with the tangible echoes of a life lived framed photographs, capturing moments long past. Sandy's kindergarten drawing proudly displayed on a small easel, a candid shot of Jack laughing heartily in the garden bathed in afternoon light. Eli's smudged watercolor painting still stubbornly affixed to the refrigerator door with a magnetic fruit slice. These walls held our shared history, a museum of memories. But lately, the house felt more like a static exhibit dedicated to someone else's life, a life that no longer included me. I walked to the kitchen, went through the ingrained ritual of making coffee, and sat down at the table where Sandy used to hunch over her homework assignments, chewing on her pencil. I stared out the window at the empty swing set in the backyard, swaying slightly in the faint breeze. I couldn't escape the echo of her voice. "You're just too much sometimes. Not everything needs your input. Just let us do things our way." It wasn't just the harshness of the words themselves that had broken through my defenses. It was the chilling ease, the practiced cadence with which she delivered them, as if they had been waiting, rehearsed, overdue. For the vast majority of my adult life, I had been indispensable. I was the person who always showed up, who brought warm soup when she was sick with the flu, who stayed up late into the night, sewing elaborate costumes for school plays, who answered panicked late-night phone calls during teenage breakups and post-college career crises. I had given and given and given, pouring every ounce of my energy, time, and resources into being her mother. I hadn't done it because I expected lavish praise or constant recognition, but because I genuinely believed that was the fundamental nature of love. Love showed up. Love nurtured. Love sacrificed. But now it seemed I was merely a burden, an inconvenient accessory she could display when it suited her image of a perfect family, and easily tuck away when I complicated her carefully constructed world. I didn't confront her after that dinner. I didn't compose a lengthy, heartbroken text message or attempt to schedule a formal talk to hash things out. I simply stepped back, quietly, completely. That week, I returned the spare key she had given me years ago, the one that symbolized my access to her home and her life. I slipped it into a plain envelope, sealed it, and left it in her mailbox. No note. Nothing to explain the silence that would follow. When Eli's school sent out invitations for their annual grandparents' luncheon, I didn't RSVP. I saw the photos later posted online by the school, or perhaps another parent, Sandy, smiling, holding Eli's hand with Jack's mother beside her. She looked lovely, dressed in practical navy fitting seamlessly into the scene. That used to be me. I stopped offering to pick Eli up from soccer practice or school events. I didn't ask if they needed help on weekends. I didn't offer unsolicited advice when I heard through Judith that Sandy had been passed over for a significant promotion at work. I simply let her be. I let them all be. Judith, my late husband's sister, a woman who had been a steady grounding presence in my life, called me a few days later. Her voice on the phone was hesitant, laced with concern. "Lena," she said, "are you okay? You haven't mentioned Sandy in weeks, and that's not like you." I paused, considering my words carefully. I think I said the phrase, feeling true and revelatory, as I spoke it. I'm learning how to let go of someone who has already let go of me. Judith was silent for a few moments, processing my words. Then I heard her sigh softly on the other end of the line. "Took you long enough?" She said, not unkindly, but with a weariness that suggested she had seen this coming long before I had. That made me laugh, a short, sharp sound that wasn't truly joyous, but felt more like breathing after being underwater for too long. The profound thing was, I didn't withdraw from a place of blazing anger or bitter resentment. I didn't stomp my feet, scream my frustrations, or compose long accusatory letters detailing the ways I had been hurt. I left from a place of profound exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep tired that sleep cannot alleviate, the kind that seeps into your very being when you have spent too long shrinking yourself, making yourself smaller and smaller to fit into someone else's life, someone else's expectations. And so, I began the slow, deliberate process of living again, but this time, living for myself. I stopped rearranging my days, my weeks, my entire schedule around Sandy's potential needs or last-minute requests. I canceled a standing alert on my phone that had been set years ago, a gentle reminder to check in with Sandy today. I deleted the massive digital folder labeled Sandy, Recipes to Pass Down, a collection of handwritten notes, magazine clippings, and printed pages I had carefully curated over 2 decades, imagining us one day baking together, sharing secrets and stories. Instead of spending my evenings scrolling through her social media for glimpses of Eli or her life, I started reading more actual books, thick, absorbing novels, and insightful non-fiction that I had never had the time for when I was too busy managing everyone else's schedule and emotional landscape. I walked to the local community center and on a whim signed up for a watercolor painting class, something I had always wanted to try. I even accepted an invitation from Judith for a weekend retreat by a quiet lake, where we sat for hours talking openly about our late husbands, reminiscing about our youth, and acknowledging the immense, often invisible labor that women carry, until we finally, sometimes belatedly, decide to put it down. One afternoon, while finally tackling the dusty chaos of the attic, I unearthed an old box containing baby things. Inside, I found the tiny baby blanket I had crocheted with clumsy, hopeful stitches before Sandy was born. I sat down on the attic floor, the dust motes dancing in the single beam of light, filtering through a window, and ran my fingers along the soft yarn. And I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't sad, not because the memories weren't poignant, but because there was nothing left to grieve. The active grieving process, the sharp, agonizing pain of loss, had somehow already happened slowly over months and years. I had done my part. I had given everything I could. I folded the blanket gently, reverently, placed it in a smaller box, labeled it simply Memories, and packed it away not as a symbol of loss, but as a closed chapter. Sandy never called to ask why I stopped coming around. She didn't inquire why I no longer brought gifts for Eli's birthday, why I didn't send reminders for dentist appointments I used to track, or why the homemade soup no longer appeared on their porch during flu season. Maybe she noticed, maybe a quiet part of her registered the absence, maybe she didn't. But she said nothing, and for the very first time in my life, neither did I. There exists a certain kind of silence that does not originate from peace or contentment. It is a silence that comes from being systematically erased from having your presence deemed non-essential. My house felt too large in those days, not in terms of actual square footage, but in the sheer volume of embedded memory. Every corner seemed to whisper reminders of a life that had once been vibrant and full. The hallway mirror still reflected the image of the woman who used to stand there, patiently braiding Sandy's hair before school. Still bore the faint, smudged imprint of Eli's small handprint from the last time he had run gleefully through the hallway on his way to the backyard. But now it all felt frozen in time, like an exhibit in that museum of memory, the life that once pulsed so strongly within these walls having been slowly, silently drained out. There were entire days when I didn't speak a single word out loud. I no longer had anyone to call in the evenings, no dinner plans to shop for, no birthdays to circle on the calendar and plan around. My phone remained resolutely quiet, save for the impersonal pings of promotional texts or automated appointment reminders. I began to hate the sound of a notification, not because it arrived, but because of the crushing certainty that it would never ever be from her. One particularly difficult Saturday, I decided to visit the local farmer's jacket, a place I used to frequent with Eli. He would bound along beside me, his small hand in mine, his eyes wide with wonder at the colorful displays. He'd beg relentlessly for kettle corn, a sugary cloud of temptation, and he'd approach every apple sample booth with a solemn, critical air, offering serious commentary, as if he were a seasoned fruit sommelier. That day I stood alone by a honey booth, staring at a jar of golden clover honey, a flavor I knew he once loved more than any other. Tears pricked at the back of my eyes, a sudden, unexpected wave of grief. I blinked them back quickly, forcing them away before anyone could see. I walked home with an empty tote bag, the weight of my solitude, heavier than any groceries could have been. Nights were often the worst. I'd sit on the edge of my bed, the lamp casting a warm, lonely glow, holding my phone, my thumb hovering over her contact name. Sometimes I'd scroll back through our old text threads, reading the brief, simple messages that used to feel like lifelines, small assurances of my value. Thanks for picking him up. You're the best, Mom. Couldn't do this without you. Now those words read like hollow echoes from a stranger, ghosts of a relationship that no longer existed. I tried desperately to fill the yawning space she had left. I joined a knitting circle at the local church, hoping for connection, but I felt out of place, like I didn't possess the right kind of sorrow. Some women had lost husbands after decades of marriage. Others were battling serious illnesses with quiet bravery. My grief felt different, less definable, less visible. No one brings casseroles or organizes meal trains when your own daughter simply decides you are no longer needed, when she slowly phases you out of her life. One morning, I caught a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror, and barely recognized the woman staring back. My hair was unbrushed, my eyes were tired, clouded with a sadness that seemed to have settled permanently, and my shoulders slouched in a way they never had when I felt useful and needed. I looked like someone who had been waiting for far too long, for someone to see her, to love her again. That afternoon, compelled by an unseen force, I opened a closet I hadn't touched in years and pulled out a box labeled simply Sandy. Inside were dozens of keepsakes, tangible fragments of our shared past, the plastic hospital bracelet from her birth, her painstakingly neat kindergarten report card, faded photographs of us baking together in flour-covered aprons, our faces dusted with white. My hand landed on a drawing she made when she was 6 years old. 2 stick figures holding hands rendered in bright, wobbly crayon lines, clearly labeled, me and Mommy. A sharp, painful breath caught in my throat. What had changed? How did we get from that simple, unconditional bond to this aching chasm I knew intellectually, that I wasn't a perfect mother? No one is. I had my flaws, certainly. I worried too much, I gave advice too freely. I probably hovered when I should have stepped back and allowed her to stumble and find her own way. But everything I did, every single action and decision, came from a place of deep, fierce, unrelenting love. And now it felt as though none of that mattered, as though the person I had loved the longest, the one I had literally given life to, had simply decided I was disposable, a discarded item from her past. I sank to the floor, the drawing clutched in my hands. Hours passed. The light in the room shifted imperceptibly from warm gold to a dull, somber gray. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I just sat there, the silence of the house pressing in on me. That I knew later was my absolute lowest point. Not the crushing loneliness, not the deafening silence, but the brutal, unavoidable realization that I had spent 62 years of my life giving and giving and giving, pouring myself out for others. And now there was virtually no one left who even asked how I was doing, how I was feeling, if I needed anything. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I didn't turn on the television for background noise. I simply went to bed, and before I closed my eyes, staring into the comforting darkness of my familiar room, I whispered the words, a soft, ragged promise to myself. I can't keep living like this. It wasn't a plea for help, not a surrender to despair. It was a quiet, determined declaration. Something fundamental had to change, because the woman I had become, quiet, overlooked, waiting, was not, could not be, who I was meant to be. I didn't know what the next step would be. I didn't have a carefully constructed plan laid out. But I knew one thing with absolute crystalline certainty. I would not spend the remainder of my life mourning someone who was still alive, still walking the earth, choosing to live her life without me. The change that followed didn't arrive with a dramatic revelation, a sudden lightning bolt of clarity, or a grand sweeping gesture. It came instead quietly on a rainy Thursday afternoon. On that particular day, for no reason I could immediately articulate, I decided to tackle the small metal filing cabinet tucked away in the corner of my bedroom closet, the one I hadn't opened in years, perhaps even a decade. It was crammed full of accumulated paper, old bank statements, dating back years' insurance forms, expired warranties for long-forgotten appliances, and countless manila envelopes that had yellowed and softened at the corners with age. I wasn't searching for anything in particular. I simply needed to do something, anything, that felt productive, that imposed some sense of order on the chaos, both external and internal. I sifted through the papers mechanically, my movements rote and unthinking, until my hand landed on a thicker-than-average folder made of dark green cardstock. I pulled it out, feeling the unexpected weight of its contents before I even opened it. My will. The one I had drafted nearly a decade ago, back when my life felt settled and my future seemed predictable. Back when I had absolutely no doubt about who everything I owned would ultimately go to. I opened the folder slowly, almost reverently, as if it held secrets, half expecting the clean black ink on the page to magically reflect the painful reality of my current life. But of course it didn't. There it was, dark and unambiguous, typed in a clear, formal font. Primary beneficiary Sandy J. Darrow. Secondary beneficiary Eli R. Darrow to inherit in trust until the age of 25. My modest house, the majority of my accumulated savings, my grandmother's treasured wedding ring, the antique mirror hanging in the hallway that had belonged to my mother, my teacher's pension, my entire jewelry box filled with heirlooms. Everything was designated for her, and subsequently for him. Each line of legal text was in its own silent way a love letter she had never read, a tangible documentation of a lifetime of sacrifices, hopes, and unconditional love meticulously planned for her future. I had envisioned her receiving it all, not as a handout, but as a continuation, believing she would carry forward the legacy of our family, our history, with care, gratitude, and a sense of connection to the women who came before her. I believed that everything I had managed to build, even the little bit that it was, would mean something profound to her, would be valued. But now the harsh reality was that I couldn't even count on a phone call on Christmas morning. Now I was the family ghost, someone she might occasionally reference when it was convenient or necessary for her image, and someone she otherwise ignored the rest of the time. As I sat there staring at her name on that page, something else shifted inside me. It wasn't a resurgence of anger, not a desire for petty revenge or spite. It was something quieter, more profound. It was like seeing the truth, the unvarnished reality of the situation for the very first time, plain and undeniable. This woman, my daughter, the one I had poured every fiber of my being into raising, shaping, and supporting, no longer saw me as vital, as essential to her life. She had grown into someone who tolerated my presence when necessary, not someone who genuinely valued my contributions or my company. And yet here I was, still planning to gift her everything I had worked my entire life to build and preserve, even in death. It felt absurd. I set the will down on the small table beside the filing cabinet and looked around my room. The shelves were lined with books, photographs, and objects, each a reminder of the various facets of who I had been throughout my life. A dedicated mother, a passionate teacher, a wife who loved deeply, a woman who once believed her love was so strong it could never be outgrown, never become obsolete. I realized with a jolt that went straight to my core that I had been waiting for permission, waiting for a sign from her that it was okay to finally take my own life back, to prioritize my own well-being and happiness. But I didn't need permission, not from her, not from anyone. Later that evening, as the rain continued to fall softly outside, I opened a large storage chest situated at the foot of my bed, a place where I kept things too precious to discard, but too painful to display. Inside were a few select items I hadn't looked at in years, old photo albums, filled with faded snapshots, a small collection of sentimental keepsakes, and tucked carefully beneath a pile of old scarves, a letter my husband Jack had written to me on our 15th wedding anniversary. He died 2 years later. I had kept that letter, pulled it out, and reread it countless times over the years, primarily because of the final powerful line, "No matter what happens, Lena." He had written in his familiar, slightly messy script, "No matter what life throws our way, never forget that you were never made to be invisible." That sentence stopped me cold. Invisible. That was precisely what I had become, not just to Sandy, but more damningly to myself. I had systematically whittled myself down, molded myself into a shape defined by service and silence, prioritizing her needs, her desires, her life, until there was almost nothing left of the original Lena. And for what I pulled out, my old laptop dusted it off and searched online for Tom, my longtime attorney. He had technically retired a few years prior, but his firm was still active, run by a capable team he had trained. I found the number and left a message requesting an appointment as soon as possible. Then I sat back, closed the green folder containing the old will, and set it aside. Something fundamental had clicked into place. The discovery wasn't just the outdated will itself. It was the searing, liberating realization that while my love for Sandy was, and would likely always be, unconditional, it did not have to be unreciprocated to the detriment of my own existence. Planning for a future where everything I owned went automatically to someone who couldn't be bothered to include me in a casual Tuesday night dinner was not an act of selfless love. It was an act of profound self-erasure. The next morning I woke up with a quiet, steady resolve I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a rush of energy, but a deep, grounded sense of purpose. I made breakfast for myself. Not just a quick piece of toast grabbed on the run, but a full, proper plate fluffy, scrambled eggs, fresh berries, a steaming cup of tea served in a real ceramic mug, not a travel tumbler. While I ate, I put on one of my favorite Ella Fitzgerald records, letting the smooth, elegant music fill the corners of the house that had grown so still and silent. Then I pulled out a blank notebook and a good pen and started writing. Not angry letters to Sandy I would never send, not lengthy explanations or justifications. I simply began writing down my thoughts, what truly mattered to me at this stage of my life, what kind of legacy I wanted to leave behind, and to whom names of charities whose work I admired. Notes about Eli, the boy I still believed in, still loved fiercely, even if I could no longer easily reach him. The old will had been my planned final gift to Sandy, the culmination of a lifetime of giving. But now I was actively rethinking what kind of gift I wanted to leave, what impact I wanted to have, and for whom I wanted to have it. And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt something unfamiliar yet deeply comforting, stirring within me again, a sense of direction, of quiet, deliberate purpose. Something had undeniably changed in me, but I didn't rush it, didn't force it. I allowed it to settle, to unfold naturally, like a thick fog, lifting slowly to reveal a road I hadn't realized was there, a path I hadn't walked in years. The morning after I found my will, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at myself with entirely new eyes. I didn't look younger or suddenly stronger or magically transformed, but I looked undeniably awake. For the first time in years, the woman staring back at me wasn't just existing in relation to other people, defined solely by her roles as mother, or grandmother, or helper. She looked like someone who had remembered she had a name, a singular identity, independent of others. Lena. Not mom, not grandma, not, could you just, or, would you mind, just Lena. I spent that morning doing something I hadn't done in years. I dressed up not for anyone else, but purely for myself. Nothing extravagant, just a soft cornflower blue silk blouse I used to wear on the first day of school, each year when I was teaching. It still fit a little snug around the waist, but it buttoned. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw a flicker of her again. The woman who used to stand confidently at a chalkboard speaking with purpose and conviction, who used to command a room of restless teenagers with stories and Shakespeare. I made myself a cup of tea using a delicate china cup I usually kept tucked away, and stepped outside into the small garden in my backyard. The roses were blooming again, a testament to their own quiet resilience, delicate and persistent, despite the neglect of the past few years. I clipped a few perfect blooms and placed them in a small vase by the kitchen window. I didn't do it for potential guests, or for company that wasn't coming, or for family who no longer visited. I did it simply because I wanted beauty in my own immediate space, a small act of tending to my own environment. That week, I pulled out an old box from the back of a closet, a repository of abandoned hobbies and forgotten creative pursuits. I painted again. Not well, certainly not professionally, but freely allowing the colors to blend and flow without judgment. I walked through the local park not with a specific destination in mind, but simply for the pleasure of movement and observation, without constantly checking my phone. I browsed the town library, letting myself wander aimlessly through the stacks of books, just as I used to do when Sandy was small, and would sit patiently beside me on the carpeted floor, engrossed in her worn copy of Goodnight Moon. And slowly, gradually, I started to remember things. Not just memories of Sandy, not yet, but memories of me, the girl who had once dreamed of being a writer, filling notebooks with stories and poems. The teenager who spent her weekends volunteering at a local animal shelter, finding solace in the quiet companionship of creatures who offered unconditional affection. The young mother who, despite the exhaustion of sleepless nights, still found time to journal after midnight, back when Jack would sleep beside her, his hand resting gently on her hip, a comforting anchor. I even dug out the dusty keyboard from the guest room closet and started playing again, my fingers fumbling through old half-forgotten melodies. I wasn't good. I stumbled over chords and forgot the bridge, replaying the same simple song a dozen times. But I smiled every time I managed to string together the right notes, because they were mine. There was one moment, though, a small, quiet, unexpected encounter that truly sealed the shift for me, a moment that confirmed the change wasn't merely emotional or fleeting, but permanent. I was walking through the local grocery store, pushing my cart slowly through the produce aisle, when I ran into Mrs. Engel, an old neighbor from the block we used to live on when Sandy was a teenager. Her hair was thinner now, but her kind eyes and her distinctive voice hadn't changed at all. We chatted for a while, polite small talk, updates on mutual acquaintances as shared memories, light laughter. Then she did what so many people still did. She asked about Sandy. "How's Sandy?" she inquired, her voice warm. "Still keeping you busy, I imagine?" I paused, but this time I didn't flinch, didn't feel that familiar wave of awkwardness, or the need to create a fabricated reality. "We haven't seen each other in a bit," I said calmly, truthfully, without apology or explanation. "But I've been well. I've started painting again, actually, and I'm looking into traveling next spring. I'm thinking about Ireland." Her eyes widened slightly in surprise, then softened into a genuine smile. She nodded slowly. "Oh, Lena," she said, "it's so good to hear you're doing things for yourself." That was the word. Yourself. I hadn't heard that word applied to me in that context in years. That night back in my quiet house, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the back porch swing, pulling a soft blanket around my shoulders against the evening chill. The stars were faint, obscured slightly by city lights, but they were there. And for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting on anyone. Not for a call that might not come. Not for an apology I might never receive. Not for an invitation that felt more like an obligation. I was done waiting. I realized that somewhere in the long, slow process of grieving a living relationship, I had forgotten that my life had always fundamentally been mine. That being a mother, a good mother, a devoted mother, had been a profoundly important chapter. A beautiful, sometimes brutal, often selfless chapter. But it was not the entire story. I still had more pages to write. I didn't plan revenge. I didn't draft cutting messages in my head or rehearse angry confrontations. I simply started living differently. Quieter, stronger, more centered. Not loud, not spiteful, just awake. And in that stillness, that reclamation of my own space and time, I began finally to heal. I never said a single word to Sandy about what I was planning. There were no dramatic speeches designed to elicit guilt, no scathing letters left for her to find, no late-night phone calls filled with accusations and tearful explanations. I had done all the talking, all the pleading, all the explaining I would ever do in that relationship. What I did now, I did quietly, deliberately, not to prove a point to her, but to reclaim a life that had always been and would continue to be mine. It began with small, seemingly insignificant actions that might have appeared mundane or even passive from the outside, but which felt monumental, transformative within my own heart. I changed the beneficiary designation on my primary bank account. I opened a new savings account at a small credit union she didn't even know existed, a safe space for my own financial future separate from any past assumptions or future claims. I met with a financial planner, a kind, competent woman named Erica, who specialized in estate restructuring for women navigating later life changes. She didn't pry into the emotional reasons behind my decisions. She simply listened, patiently explained my options clearly, and nodded with a calm, firm understanding. Together we revised everything. Not just the formal will, but the entire underlying intention behind my legacy planning. I told Erica that I absolutely wanted Eli to have something, a foundation for his future. But only if certain conditions were met, conditions that would ensure the money was used wisely and purposefully. I didn't want my name, my legacy, to be remembered as a source of unearned entitlement. I wanted it to mean something, to stand for something. We set up a trust structured so that the funds would be accessible to Eli only after the age of 25, provided he had completed some form of higher education. Trade school, college, university, any path he chose that required dedication and effort. And crucially, I named my late husband's sister Judith as the trustee. She was the only person I still trusted implicitly to honor my wishes to see the spirit and intention behind the legal clauses. The house, the home that had always been assumed to be Sandy's inheritance, the solid foundation upon which I had built my life and raised my daughter, I redirected. It was to be donated to a local nonprofit organization that provided the transitional housing and support services for single mothers fleeing difficult circumstances. It wasn't an act born of spite or bitterness towards Sandy. It felt instead like a profound act of coming full circle. The home that had carried me through years of single motherhood, through sacrifice and struggle, could now provide refuge and opportunity for someone else. A mother who hadn't had the advantages and safety net that Sandy had been born into, advantages she had seemingly come to take for granted. The most emotionally difficult decisions involved the jewelry. I held each piece in my hand before letting it go, each one weighted with memory. My mother's delicate strand of pearls, my grandmother's intricately carved brooch, the simple gold wedding band Jack had placed on my finger all those years ago, warm against my skin. I donated the majority of the pieces to the women's shelter's annual fundraising auction, knowing the money would go directly to supporting women who were starting over with nothing. The rest, a select few pieces I wanted Eli to have someday, I carefully packaged into a small velvet-lined box. Not for Sandy to hold on to, but to be given directly to Eli when he was old enough. I included a letter for him in the box, a letter he would receive when the time was right. It wasn't a bitter letter, not filled with blame or resentment. It was a letter filled with truth, about who I was, about the choices I made, about how fiercely I had loved him, about how sometimes love manifests not in loud displays or constant indulgence, but in quiet protection and setting firm boundaries, even when it's painful. Each day I made another decision, another quiet correction. Small, private, incredibly powerful acts of self-reclamation. I didn't post any of it on social media. I didn't talk about it at my knitting circle or watercolor class. I didn't even tell Judith all the details right away. I simply kept moving forward one intentional step at a time, rebuilding the architecture of my own life. When the legal revisions were complete, the final document signed and notarized, my attorney Tom, still sharp and perceptive, despite his semi-retirement, looked at me across his large oak desk. "You're sure about this, Lena?" he asked, his expression thoughtful. I smiled a genuine, unforced smile this time, and nodded completely. "Yes, Tom," I said. "I am absolutely sure." He leaned back in his chair, a soft, knowing laugh escaping his lips. "You know," he said, "most people who go through something like this making such significant changes, they're still trying to send a message. To punish, to get attention." "I'm not sending anything," I replied calmly, the words feeling utterly true. "I'm just done weighting the matter." After leaving his office feeling lighter than I had in years, I stopped at a small cafe downtown, a place I hadn't visited in years but remembered fondly. I ordered a latte, found a quiet table by the window, and opened my notebook. I began listing all the places I wanted to visit, all the experiences I wanted to have before I turned 70. Nothing extravagant, no luxurious 5-star resorts or round-the-world cruises, just small, meaningful places that called to me the breathtaking vastness of the Grand Canyon. A cozy cabin nestled in the colorful woods of Vermont during peak fall foliage. The dusty, labyrinthine bookstore in Boston that Jack had always wanted to see, but we never found the time for. Places that reminded me that there was still so much life left, to live, so much beauty to witness. At home, I systematically boxed up old reminders of the life that was fading. I carefully removed Sandy's framed college diploma from its prominent place in the hallway and replaced it with a vibrant print of an abstract painting I had bought from a local artist at a street fair. A splash of color and energy that represented my own new creative awakening. I took down the large wall calendar that was still jacked with Eli's school events I was rarely invited to attend anymore. I even deleted the annual reminder that popped up on my phone every May, Sandy's Mother's Day gift. I didn't need to be reminded anymore. This wasn't an act of bitterness or erasure of the past. It was an act of profound clarity, of clearing space for the present and future. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was actively creating peace within myself. And perhaps the most liberating, most powerful part of it all was the knowledge that Sandy had absolutely no idea what I was doing. She likely interpreted my silence, my withdrawal, as passivity, as a quiet retreat into the background, like a dim light left on out of habit. But I wasn't dim. I was deliberate. I wasn't fading. I was refocusing. And while she went about her life, perhaps certain that I was still sitting in the corner patiently waiting for an invitation. Waiting for a place at her table, I was quietly, steadily building a new table of my own, one she might never be invited to join. At first, the magnitude of the changes I had set in motion didn't seem to register with Sandy. Or if they did, she didn't give any indication, choosing not to acknowledge them. Perhaps hoping that if she ignored my quiet rebellion, long enough I would eventually come back around, softened by time and loneliness, ready to resume my role as the ever-available mother, the reliable backup. But I wasn't rebelling. I wasn't acting out of anger, not anymore. I was simply, profoundly done. The first ripple of change she might have noticed came with a missed favor. She called one Thursday afternoon, her voice clipped and urgent while I was happily immersed in my watercolor class, a new routine that had quickly become a source of quiet joy and focus. "Hey," she said without preamble. "Can you pick up Eli from school today? Jack and I are both stuck at work." I paused, brush suspended in the air, looking out the studio window at the soft rain beginning to fall over the parking lot. I felt no flicker of guilt, no instinctive urge to say yes. "Sorry," I replied calmly. "I'm in the middle of something right now. You might want to try Judith. She mentioned she had a flexible schedule this week." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Right," she finally said, her voice tight. "Okay, I'll figure it out." And she did. The world, I noted with a quiet sense of wonder, did not collapse simply because I wasn't there to catch the pieces. And rejackably, I didn't feel bad about it. I returned to my painting, focusing on the delicate petals of a lilac flower, slightly off-center perhaps, but beautiful all the same. Then came the weekend gathering. It used to be a given and unwritten family rule that I would bring dessert, specifically my lemon chess pie, a recipe passed down through generations, a sweet, tangy tradition everyone expected and devoured. I heard about this particular gathering secondhand from Judith, who had been invited. No one called me. I didn't offer the pie. I spent that Sunday morning instead walking slowly through the botanical gardens, breathing in the clean, damp air, admiring the late-season blooms, and watching strangers smile at one another, without expectation, without history, without obligation. Days passed then, a week, and slowly, subtly, I began to notice a change, not just in me, but in her. She started calling more often, not for extended chats or emotional connection, but to ask practical questions, questions that revealed a quiet disorientation. "Did you get the Christmas lights up yet? Are you still planning to come with us to the tree farm this year? I was thinking of making that stuffing you do for Thanksgiving. What's in it again?" Each time I answered her, honestly, politely, but without overextending myself, without the desperate eagerness that had characterized my responses in the past. I didn't jump to say yes to every implied invitation. I didn't offer extras, didn't volunteer more than was asked. I was simply polite, clear, and calm. And the more I held these quiet, firm boundaries, the more confused, the more uncertain she seemed to become. Once she even texted, "Hey, I haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" I stared at that message for a long time, a small, quiet smile playing on my lips. Everything I realized was finally okay, because for the very first time, I wasn't frantically scrambling to earn her love, her approval, her attention. I was simply living fully and authentically within the bounds of my own life, a life I had finally reclaimed. The real turning point, the moment where the shift became undeniably clear to both of us, occurred during a family brunch hosted by Jack's parents. I decided to go primarily for Eli's sake. When I walked in, he immediately ran to me, his arms wrapping tightly around my waist, that same bright, unconditional light in his eyes that reminded me that not everything had been lost. But Sandy, she looked startled when she saw me, almost nervous, as if my presence now carried a different weight, a different energy. It was as though she could feel viscerally that I was no longer orbiting her life, but standing firmly in my own. Throughout the meal, I smiled politely, made small talk with Jack's relatives, and consciously refrained from inserting myself into the conversations, from offering unsolicited opinions or assistance. I didn't offer to help in the kitchen, a role I had automatically assumed for years. I didn't try to smooth over the tension when Sandy snapped impatiently at Jack over something trivial. I wasn't cold or distant. I was simply separate, observing, present, but not integrated in the way I once had been. And I could feel her noticing it acutely. After dessert, as people began to mingle and pack up leftovers, she pulled me aside, her voice low, a hint of uncertainty in it. "You've been different lately," she said, studying my face intently as if searching for clues. I smiled gently. "I guess I have," I replied, stating the simple truth. "Is something wrong?" She pressed her brow furrowed. "No," I said, meeting her gaze steadily. "Nothing is wrong. I'm just choosing to spend my time a little differently these days, that's all." She opened her mouth as if she might say more, perhaps demanding further explanation, perhaps wanting to launch into another justification of her own behavior. But then she stopped the words catching in her throat. And in that pause, in that subtle moment of uncertainty, in her hesitation, I felt it, the power of the shift. For so many years I had lived on the edges of her approval, tailoring myself to fit her ever-changing expectations. But now she was the one who was unsure, the one reaching, measuring, wondering how much of me she still had access to, how much of my support she could still command. My silence, my quiet, deliberate withdrawal had become infinitely stronger, more impactful than any words I could have possibly uttered. I didn't need to prove anything to her. I didn't need her to notice the change for it to be real. But she had noticed, and it had unsettled her more profoundly than any confrontation ever could have. That night, I returned home to my quiet house, lit a scented candle, and put on one of my husband's old jazz records, the smooth notes filling the space. I stood by the window sipping a cup of chamomile tea and thought, this is what it feels like to stand finally in your own life. Not waiting, not chasing, not trying to earn your place. Just standing, steady, grounded, whole. It wasn't planned. There was no dramatic orchestration, no audience waiting with bated breath for the climactic scene. Just a phone call, a simple calendar reminder, and a room. My lawyer Tom had called me a week earlier. "Lena," he had said, his voice kind and professional. "Everything is finalized. All the documents have been signed, witnessed, and notarized according to your instructions. You mentioned you wanted a formal reading of the will. Are you still set on doing that?" "Yes," I had replied without hesitation. I want it done while I am still here to look them in the eye. Tom didn't question my request. He simply set a date and assured me of his absolute discretion. I requested one thing: that Sandy, Jack, Judith, and Eli be present. Not because I harbored any desire to create a scene or cause unnecessary distress, but because I wanted absolute clarity. No misinterpretations, no whispered accusations or fabrications later on. Just the truth spoken once, formally and plainly. Sandy's voice on the phone had been hesitant when I extended the invitation to his office. "You're doing a will reading now?" She had asked, a note of suspicion in her tone. "You're not sick, are you, Mom?" "No," I had replied calmly. "But I have made some significant changes to my estate planning, and I want to make sure everyone understands exactly what is in place moving forward." "Oh," she had said, clearly thrown off balance. "Okay." The day arrived. I chose to wear a simple navy sweater and well-fitting slacks, the same kind of understated professional outfit I used to wear for parent-teacher conferences years ago. Not overly formal, but composed, intended to convey that I was a person with something important to say and a valid reason for being heard. The meeting room at Tom's office was modest: a long polished table, comfortable chairs, a pitcher of water with neatly stacked glasses. Eli, looking slightly bewildered, sat fidgeting nervously next to Sandy, who was seated directly across the table from me, her expression carefully unreadable. A mask I knew well. Jack sat beside her, his posture conveying a distinct air of boredom and detachment, as if he wanted no part of whatever was about to unfold. Judith, seated beside me, offered my hand a quiet, reassuring squeeze under the table. Tom began, his voice calm and measured. "Thank you all for coming today," he said, looking around the table. "Lena has requested that I read through her final will and testament so that there is no confusion regarding her wishes moving forward." He didn't dramatize the reading. He simply read the legal clauses aloud, clearly and precisely. As he read, mentioning beneficiaries and designations, Sandy's name never came up in the sections regarding the primary assets. Her eyes narrowed slightly at first, then her brows pulled together in a soft frown. She leaned forward almost imperceptibly, her carefully constructed composure beginning to fray, waiting perhaps for her name to appear in a later paragraph. But every significant bequest, the house, the financial accounts, the personal belongings, the heirlooms, was designated elsewhere. Judith was named as the executor tasked with overseeing the fulfillment of the will's terms. The house, my beloved home, was to be donated to the program for single mothers. The jewelry, the precious pieces I had held in my hands, had been divided between charitable auctions and a specific trust for Eli. The bulk of my savings was allocated to fund scholarships for single mothers pursuing teaching degrees, a tangible investment in futures I believed in. Eli's trust was outlined carefully delayed access until he reached maturity contingent upon specific educational milestones, with Judith named as the guardian of its conditions, ensuring my intentions were honored. Sandy sat up straighter, her back rigid against the chair. The silence in the room, thick and heavy with unspoken shock, grew more profound with each passing sentence. When Tom finished reading, he folded the document closed and placed it neatly on the table. He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. "Lena," he said gently, "would you like to say anything?" I turned my gaze towards my daughter. Her face was pale, drained of color. Her lips were slightly parted in disbelief, her eyes wide. Jack leaned away from her, almost imperceptibly, as if trying to distance himself from the impending fallout. I took a slow, deep breath, centering myself. I didn't do this to punish you. I said, my voice steady, calm, projecting the quiet strength I had found. This isn't an act of revenge. I looked at each person at the table, ensuring they heard me. This is an act of recognition. Recognition of the years I showed up, the years I waited, the countless moments I was dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel like an inconvenience. Sandy opened her mouth, a sound starting in her throat, but I gently raised a hand, a small, firm gesture to stop her. No, I said quietly but with absolute authority. Let me finish, because this... I swept my hand across the table, indicating the room, the will, the moment. This is the only time we are ever going to have this conversation. She closed her mouth, her hands clenching into tight fists in her lap, her eyes fixed on mine. I loved you, Sandy. I continued the words, simple, raw, undeniably true. More than anything in the world, being your mother was the greatest privilege and joy of my life. But somewhere along the line, I stopped being a person to you. I became a tool, something to use when it was convenient, to ignore when it wasn't. I forgave that for a very long time. I made excuses for your behavior. I took immense pride in your accomplishments, even when you subtly pretended that my support, my sacrifices, had played no part in them. But I am not going to pretend anymore. I looked at Eli, then his young face, a study in confusion. Perhaps even a touch of fear caught between the adults. My voice softened, directed only at him, Eli. I said, if you are hearing this years from now, reading about this, I hope you know that this was never about cutting people off, about being mean or vindictive. It was about honoring myself, about recognizing my own worth. I still believe in you, Eli. I always will. That's why you are still a part of this legacy. But love, true love, isn't just about biology or obligation. It's about respect, about valuing another person, and yes, about boundaries. I turned back to Sandy, the weight of years settling between us. I am not angry anymore. I stated calmly, the truth of it resonating within me. But I have made my peace with the life I lived and the woman I became because of it. This, I gestured again to the will. This is the legacy I choose to leave. The silence that followed my words was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. Sandy looked as if she had been physically struck, her face, frozen in disbelief. But then I saw it, a flicker in her eyes, a fleeting expression. Not hatred, not defiance, but something else entirely. Recognition. A dawning awareness of the consequences of her actions, not just for her, but for her perception of herself. Abruptly, she pushed her chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. I need some air. She mumbled, her voice choked. Without another word, she turned and walked quickly out of the room, her back straight, her shoulders rigid. Jack hesitated for a second, glancing between Sandy's retreating figure and me, before quietly rising and following her. Judith placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, her touch a silent affirmation. Eli, still sitting across the table, looked from the doorway where his parents had vanished back to me. He didn't say anything, didn't ask questions. He simply slid out of his chair, walked around the table and hugged me tightly, his small arms wrapped around my waist. It was a silent embrace full of quiet comfort and understanding. That was the moment that truly mattered. Not the formal reading of the will, not the shock, not the strained silence, but that hug, that quiet acknowledgement from the one person in the room who might still, with time and intention, grow into something different, something more open and loving. And in that instant, despite the pain of the preceding years, despite the difficulty of the decision I had made, I felt no regret, A week passed after the will reading, and I didn't hear a word from Sandy. Not a phone call, not a text message, not even a cold line of protest or accusation filtered through Judith. I wasn't surprised. Silence had always been her tool, a passive-aggressive weapon she wielded expertly, a way to assert control and inflict discomfort without having to engage directly or get her hands dirty with actual conflict. But this time, it didn't work the way she intended. This time, her silence felt small, insignificant against the backdrop of the peace I had finally found. Then late on a Friday evening, as I was wiping down the kitchen counters, my phone buzzed 6 times in quick succession. 6 missed calls, all from her. I watched the screen light up from across the kitchen, the name Sandy, glowing in sharp white letters, pulsing with an undeniable urgency. I didn't pick up. Not the first time. Not the second. Not even when a text message followed immediately. "We need to talk, please." She almost never used the word please. I turned the phone face down on the counter and let the screen go black. The next morning, a Saturday, I drove out to a small wooded trail. Jack and I used to hike years ago before his stroke changed everything. It was shaded by tall sycamore trees, their branches reaching towards each other, and it opened up eventually to a modest overlook where you could see the river carving its quiet path through the rolling hills below. I brought a small thermos of coffee, a notebook I had started filling with my thoughts, and my peace. I sat on a smooth, sun-warmed rock sipping my coffee, feeling more grounded, more present than I had in years. When I returned home, there was a thick envelope waiting on the front porch, a hand-delivered. No postage, no return address. My name was written on the front in Sandy's precise, familiar handwriting. Inside, I found a printed letter 3 pages long, typed neatly. Every paragraph was tightly worded, carefully constructed, as if she had edited and re-edited it countless times, trying to get it just right, trying to control the message. The letter began with a defense, an attempt at explaining, "I didn't realize how distant I had become," she wrote. "I was overwhelmed with work and Eli, and maybe I expected too much from you without ever thinking about what you needed. I never meant to make you feel discarded." Then came the justification, the attempt to shift responsibility slightly. "You were always so strong, Mom, so capable. I honestly thought you didn't need anything from me. You were just always there no matter what. I assumed you always would be." And finally, the carefully phrased plea. "I was shocked by the will. I didn't expect to be left out. It doesn't feel right. Can we talk? I think we both made mistakes." What she meant, I understood with absolute clarity, was that not having control didn't feel right to her. That my silence, my independent choices had disrupted a system she had come to rely on, a system where she set the terms, and I quietly absorbed the emotional costs. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer beside the legal copy of my new will. I didn't respond. That same weekend, a few days later, I received a phone call from the director of the women's shelter, where I had donated most of my jewelry. "Miss Darrow," she said, her voice thick with genuine gratitude and emotion. "I wanted to call personally and let you know. Your generous donation, those beautiful pieces you gave us, raised over $18,000 at our gala auction last night. That money, that's going to house 3 mothers and their children for 6 months, providing them with safety, stability, and support as they rebuild their lives." I sat down in my chair, my hand trembling slightly as I held the phone. 3 mothers, 3 children, 6 months of stability, 6 months of hope. 3 lives changed because I chose to redirect my legacy, not out of anger, but out of purpose, out of a desire to make a tangible difference that I realized was justice, not vengeance, not punishment, inflicted upon Sandy, but a powerful redirection of my resources to where they could genuinely grow and uplift. Later that evening, as I watched the sun dip below the neighbor's fence line, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from Jack, short and unexpected. I know things are tense right now, but I just wanted to say, I read the trust paperwork. You've done right by Eli. Whether or not Sandy sees it, I do. That truly surprised me. Jack had always played the quiet diplomatic role, supportive of Sandy but largely distant from our dynamic. But this felt different. It felt like genuine acknowledgement, like respect. I typed a short reply. "Thank you, Jack. That means more than you know." After that, I didn't hear directly from Sandy again for a while. And oddly beautifully, that was fine. For the first time, her absence didn't create a painful ache. It simply created space for other things to bloom, space for my own life to expand. I started volunteering once a week at the local literacy center downtown, helping adult learners improve their reading and writing skills, helping women find confidence in expressing themselves. Women who, like me, had perhaps once been told they were too much or not enough. I reconnected with an old college friend who invited me to stay with her in Maine for a long overdue reunion filled with coastal walks and shared stories. And Eli, my sweet Eli. He began writing me letters, not quick emails or dashed-off texts, but real handwritten letters penned on lined paper folded carefully. He told me about a book he liked, about a poem he had written for school, about how much he missed my French toast on Saturday mornings. He signed the bottom of the first letter in his slightly wobbly print. "Love you, Grandma. I always will." That, I understood, was the truest, deepest justice, not what Sandy had lost in material terms, but what I had gained. A sense of purpose, a connection that felt unconditional, a quiet confirmation that my love and my presence had mattered to him, even if they had become inconvenient for her. Not a courtroom victory, not a headline-worthy twist, but simply a life reclaimed, a legacy, reimagined, a quiet, steady correction decades in the making. It was early spring when it happened, a Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in my backyard garden, muddy-kneed, carefully pruning the rose bushes that had somehow made it through another winter, their thorny branches a symbol of quiet resilience. The air was soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint, hopeful hum of bees returning to their work. I wore a wide-brimmed straw hat Jack had bought me years ago, at a farmer's jacket, and my gloves were stained with the memory of every growing season that had come before. I clipped a single rose, a delicate pale pink, its edges slightly curled perfectly, imperfect, and held it in my hand for a moment, just long enough to admire its stubborn beauty after surviving so much cold. That flower felt like me. Life hadn't magically returned to what it once was, but I had stopped trying to bend time backward, stopped trying to recapture a past that no longer fit. I didn't want the past anymore. I wanted what was real, what was grounded in the present, what was earned through my own efforts. I had created new routines, small but sacred rituals that anchored my days. Sunday mornings were now dedicated to a slow, leisurely walk to the corner bakery for a warm cinnamon roll and a large coffee enjoyed in quiet solitude or shared with a book. Wednesdays were reserved for the quiet focus of watercolor class. Fridays, I spent several hours volunteering at the literacy center downtown, helping women from all walks of life find confidence in their own voices. Women who, like me, had perhaps once been made to feel they were too much or not enough. My home had changed too, reflecting the shifts within me. The living room no longer felt like a museum of obligation. I had replaced the framed photos of forced smiles and distant gatherings with artwork I had painted myself. Clumsy, maybe imperfect, certainly, but undeniably mine. The couch had a new soft linen slipcover. The walls a fresh coat of soothing sage green paint. The guest room, once perpetually ready for visitors who rarely came, had been transformed into a small, dedicated studio space. And on the desk sat a folder labeled simply Letters to Myself. Inside were pages I had written in recent months. Not journal entries documenting daily events, not letters addressed to Sandy or Eli, but letters addressed to the woman I had become and the woman I was still becoming. Sometimes I wrote as if I were talking to my younger self, offering comfort and reminding her that she had done the best she could with the knowledge she had at the time. Other times I wrote to the woman I hoped to be 10 years from now, urging her not to shrink, not to dim her light, just to keep the peace, to always choose herself. There was no bitterness left. That surprised me more than anything. I had fully expected to carry some small, lingering ember of anger, a tiny flame of hurt I could keep hidden deep in my chest, just for myself a quiet companion. But it was gone, not buried or suppressed, but genuinely gone, replaced with something quieter, sturdier, more resilient acceptance. Sandy hadn't tried to see me again after dropping off Eli that weekend, but she had sent another short letter through Judith a few weeks prior. In it, she acknowledged her pride, her failure to listen, and the simple, devastating way she had taken me for granted, assuming my presence was a constant, like the sun rising. She didn't explicitly ask for forgiveness, not directly, but she said she was working on herself, trying to understand her own motivations and the impact of her actions. That acknowledgement, however imperfect, meant more than I ever thought it would. I didn't reply to that letter either, not because I was shutting the door permanently, but because I didn't want to rush anything, didn't want to fall back into old patterns. Rebuilding a relationship, especially one so deeply wounded, is like tending a fragile garden after a frost. You don't stomp in with grand gestures and unrealistic expectations. You approach it with patience, caution, and a willingness to let it grow at its own pace, or perhaps sometimes not at all. Eli wrote me again last week. He told me about a school project on family heritage and said he wanted to interview me if I was up for it. I wrote back right away telling him he could absolutely come over the following Saturday, and we would bake cookies while we talked, just the two of us. That was enough. More than enough. As I stood in the garden holding the pale pink rose, I thought about legacy again. Not the legal kind, not what's written into wills or carved into gravestones, but the kind that truly lives. The kind that's felt in the way someone's face softens when they think of you. The kind that's baked into family recipes, lovingly passed down, tucked inside stories, shared at dinner tables. The kind that's felt in the quiet power of choosing yourself, of honoring your own worth even when it's incredibly difficult. I walked inside and placed the rose into a small vase on my kitchen windowsill. It didn't match anything else in the room. The vase was old, slightly chipped, handed down from my mother. But it held the flower just fine, providing it with stability and a place to simply be. Sometimes I realize that's all any of us need, a little space to stand something solid to hold on to, and the quiet, determined decision to bloom again on our own terms. Later, as dusk began to settle, I turned off the porch, light-locked the front door, and poured myself a final cup of tea. I sat by the window, the single rose, a soft blur of color in the fading light, watching the last of the evening sun stretch long golden fingers across the backyard. The light touched everything gently, impartially, without needing permission, without demanding recognition. And in that still, quiet, golden moment, I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I hadn't just removed a name from a legal document. I had finally and completely reclaimed my life.